I'd like to welcome Alan Andersen, who's going to give us a talk today on Savanna fire and biodiversity findings from a long-tailed field experiment. Please, Alan, come take it away.
Thanks everyone for coming along. As many of you will know, CDU has been leading the long-term fire experiment at the Terrestrial Wildlife Park at Berry Springs, and it's played an important role in RIEL's research and teaching. And we just recently had our 20th anniversary of experimental fires, and so I thought it would be a good time to come and have a bit of a talk about the experiment and what its contribution has been to our understanding of how fire affects biodiversity, but fauna in particular. So here in Darwin, we have the pleasure of living in the most flammable biome of the world's most flammable continent. And so here's a map of fire frequency over a 10-year period, with the yellows fires pretty well every second year, the reds fires pretty well every year. And a map like this will probably surprise most Australians, because if you read the media, one would think that, well, fire's just an issue down in southern temperate forests, isn't it? Well, no, most of the fire action very clearly is in here. And the yellows and reds essentially define the tropical savanna biome. And the reds, you can see at the higher rainfall, where, like here in the top end, fire is just a pretty well an annual event. And as we also know, that's because of our wet, dry, tropical climate. That is, every wet season, we have lots and lots of herbaceous matter produced. And as a 4 or 5 month dry season dries off, we have fuel for fire every year. And even when it burns, the following year, we still have enough fuel for fire the next year and so on. It's very different from other biomes. A highly frequent fire is not just a thing of Northern Australia, it's a feature of tropical savannas throughout the world. And in fact, it's more than just a feature. Frequent fire has played a key role in the evolution of tropical savanna biodiversity. And this is particularly the case in higher rainfall areas, where if it weren't for fire, there would not be tropical savanna and its incredible biodiversity, which in many ways is comparable to that in tropical rainforest. There'd be dry forest, much lower diversity system in dry forest. So frequent fire has played a key role in the evolution of tropical savannas, and that's over the last 3 to 5 million years. So you all will be aware there's been some major changes in fire regimes over, human history. So before humans arrived 50,000 or so years ago, as is the case everywhere else in the world, there's only one source of fire, ignition source, and that was lightning. And we know today that lightning only occurs in the build-up storms around October, November. It has to be lightning without rain. We can only speculate on what the fire regime under that ignition source must have been like before people. But given the extent of savanna in Australia and its incredible diversity, we know that fire has been highly frequent up here for millions of years. Now, of course, with the arrival of people about 50,000 years ago, ignition source changed, and the timing of the ignition changed from those sort of build-up storms, one to fire starting early in the dry season and being lit all through the dry season. And then, of course, with the arrival of European people a couple of 100 years ago, we've had another shift in fire regimes, with traditional burning being disrupted, and there's now has been an increase in the extent of fires later in the dry season. And fire seasonality matters, as I think many of you will know, because fires that start early in the dry season when the landscape is still moist tend to be of very low intensity, patchy, often going out at night, burning relatively small areas. But as the landscape dries out, as the leaves from deciduous plants fall to the ground and add to the litter, often doubling the litter volume, then fire intensity increases, as we know. And so fires late in the season, as we know up here, can burn for days at high intensity, burning extremely large areas. I think it's also important when we say high intensity, it's all a relative term, high as in higher than the low intensity fires in Savanna, but it's not high intensity at all from the broader fire perspective. And give you an idea of that, a typical high intensity late season fire might be 8 of the order of 8 fire intensity units, sometimes 10 with gamba grass, 20, leave that aside, sometimes 10 at the extreme. Whereas these big forest fires down south we see, that's over 100. So we're not in the ballpark of high fire intensity at all. We can never get those sort of fires up here, but still much higher. And at least visually, the impact on the landscape is dramatically different compared with the low intensity fires. And there's been a major concern that with the disruption of traditional burning and the increased extent of these late season fires, we've got a serious biodiversity conservation problem. And so the dominant management paradigm, as you all know, is one of extensive burning early in the season to break up the country, move the fuel loads and reduce the extent of late season fires. And this has become even more pronounced with the advent of savanna burning projects over the last couple of decades, which aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by switching from late to early season burning and then burning carbon credits. And I think many of you know that much of Northern Australia is under formal savanna burning projects, earning particularly traditional owners and Indigenous communities very substantial amounts of money. It's been a major economic revolution, as well as providing enormous cultural and social benefits to remote communities. So that's all very good, but what do we know about how these fires affect fauna? The answer is, well, not nearly enough. A lot of the attention of the fire fauna issue has been centred on this catastrophic declines in small mammal populations, and I think most of you are familiar with over recent decades. Absolutely catastrophic, and fire has been proposed to play a key role in those declines. Now, I'll talk more about this later, but fire is not a key story in these declines, as we'll talk about later. But I think it's also important to realise that it's an incredibly important conservation issue, but small mammals does not equal fauna more generally. And this is a slide I love showing to my small mammal colleague, Brendan Baker here. So this is a biodiversity landscape where different taxonomic groups are scaled according to their relative contribution to species. And if you did it in terms of contribution to faunal biomass, it would be a very similar thing. And so in case you missed it, these are the mammals. See this wee tiny elephant over there? That represents mammals. So clearly mammals are not representative biodiversity. And what's much more representative are these things without backbones, the invertebrates, and particularly insects represented by this ginormous beetle, where there could be how many millions of species of just beetles. So how can we understand the responses of fauna to fire? Well, there are two major ways, and the most common way is this, and that is that one produces fire history maps of landscapes like this, and then go in and do biodiversity surveys and relate the two. And this is a very common thing to do, and it's produced some really interesting and useful results. But there's two very, very serious limitations of this approach. One is that fire will always be just one of many factors influencing the distribution of plants and animals. And so you're never going to get an extremely strong signal of fire when you do that. And so these studies typically have weak and inconsistent results. The problem is they're often not presented that way. They're often presented as if they're conclusive. And I'll show this particular study by Mike Law's colleagues. And what Mike did was looked at the change or the changes in species richness at these long-term monitoring sites in Kakadu comparing what was then the most recent surveys with the surveys 5 years before. And just to lead you through this, if there had been no change, that's what that 0 is. If there had been more species, that's these things above the line. If there have been fewer species, it's below the line. And if there's sort of no species, that's where the minus 100% goes. And you can see that there is a relationship there. That is, their relationship with declining species richness with increasing fire severity. In this case, it's fire frequency. But the issue is that this relationship is extremely weak. And unlike the conclusion of the paper, it does not show that fire is a major factor causing these declines. In fact, it's quite the reverse. It shows that it's not a major factor. And so I'll just go through why I say that. And that is because if you look at where there's been a complete loss of species, that is a minus 100% of species, it occurs right across this fire gradient. So yes, it occurs where fire is highly frequent, but it also occurs where fire is not frequent. So fire can't be driving this relationship if that's the case. And similarly, if you look at where the number of species have doubled, it occurs right across this fire frequency gradient. So this relationship here has extremely low predictive power, and it doesn't show that fire is a key driving force behind the declines, and I'll come back to that later. Because I think we know it's increasingly apparent that this is the driving force, and that where fire has a role, it's just increasing the ability of cats to do this. And so this weak and consistent results, it's not just that study, but it's typically the case. So here's a study that Alison Stover-Wilson, who is a PhD student here, and she led this study, is looked at all the extensive survey data from across the top end and related, in this case, small mammal species abundances and richnesses to fire patterns. And this is what they found. Generally, we found weak and varied responses of individual mammal species to varying fire frequency. And that is not surprising, as I said, because each species is affected by a wide range of factors. And so even if fire plays a role, it's not going to come out as with a very strong signal. But there's a more important reason why these correlative studies are limited. And I think this is a really important thing to be thinking about. And that is, as we all know, a tenet of science is correlation does not equal causation, does it? We know that, we know it. The trouble is many of these correlative studies present the results of this as if they're causal, when it shouldn't be that way. And there's a real problem here, because if you ask yourself, well, what's causing the fire patterns in the first place? It's not just random. They're reflecting underlying environmental variation. That's why you've got fire patterns. And of course, the underlying environmental variation is also driving biodiversity patterns. And so, of course, you're going to get a correlation between fire patterns and biodiversity patterns. It doesn't mean it's causal at all. They're both responding to inherent environmental variation. So that's a very long way of me introducing the importance of controlled field experiments, isn't it? Oops. No, before I get onto that. So in Alison's paper, she found this. So despite the concern over fire and declining small mammals, she found that there was a positive correlation between fire activity and these declining small mammals. And that's simply because they both respond to higher rainfall. Fire activity is higher and higher rainfall. Abundance of small mammals is higher and higher rainfall. Get the correlation, got nothing to do with any causation there. Anyway, yeah, so that's what I'd say. It's a long way of coming to the really key issue that controlled field experiments are really needed if we're going to nail causation. And particularly where we have replicated fire and we have pre-fire baseline data so that we can look at changes in fire. And I came up here as a fresh-faced researcher back in the mid-80s, joining CSIRO. And back then, CSIRO ran the Palga Research Station, which was nearly 700 square kilometres of Kakadu National Park as our dedicated research station. One of the big things we did back then was set up this major landscape scale fire experiment where we divided Kapalga. So Here's Capalba. This is the South Alligator River, West Alligator River, highway out to Darwin to Jabiru. We divided it into catchment landscape areas of between 10 and 20 square kilometres, and they were our experimental units, which is incredibly ambitious, incredibly expensive, incredibly time-consuming, incredibly ambitious. And we did that for 5 years. We compared 4 different ways of burning early in the dry season every year, burning late in the dry season every year. I've just got to have a shout out to Lynn Lowe over here as part of this, and Lynn, you'll be pleased to see some results coming. And burning progressively through the dry season, which ended up not quite working because of one reason, and then unburnt. And I'm going to be talking about the early season burning, late season burning, and unburnt. We did that every year for 5 years. So it's covering the most extreme fire regimes you can have over that 5-year period, from no fire at all to burning as hot as possible for 5 years straight. That's contrasting. And because the experimental units were so big, it means that we could look at all the faunal groups, even those are quite wide ranging, because it's the 20 square kilometres is the home universe of most groups of animals, even vertebrates. And this is what Lynn would like to see. And so I just summarise some of the key results that we got from Capalba that surprised a lot of us. And one is, yeah, fire has been part of the evolutionary history of savannas or whatever, and so we expect the biota to be resilient. But the level of resilience was remarkable to us. And here's an example. So Lynn over here did all our grasshopper work, and this is from her work to just illustrate that. So we started burning here, but we spent a couple of years getting pre-burn data. And so these different colours represent the different treatments. These hadn't been treated yet, they were to be treated. This is baseline data, but you can see that before we started burning, there was no difference between the plots that were going to be burnt early, late or unburnt. And then as the years progressed, with 5 years of burning, things went up and down, but it went up and down on the same treatments that reflected whatever seasonal or whatever effects. At the end of the experiment, no difference between those 5 treatments, even though, as I say, it's the most extreme, burning late and hot as possible for 5 years straight on one hand, and no fire at all for 5 years. All right, grasshoppers. Who cares about grasshoppers? Lynn cares about grasshoppers. How about important faunal groups like vertebrates? Well, this might surprise you. So what we've got here for frogs, lizards and birds, these are the number of species that we had enough data on to be able to statistically analyse. Okay? So a lot of frogs, a lot of lizards and even more birds. These are the number of those that were affected by fire in any way. In other words, when I say affected, that we could detect any statistical difference in their abundance before and after the burning treatments. So frogs, poor little sensitive frogs, you think they'd be as thin-skinned things, they'd be affected by fire? No, only one. And the funny thing was, the one is Latoria bicolor, which many of you know, and it was most abundant under the late fires. I worked that one out. I can't work that one out. And then similarly, lizards, 16 species, common, only 5 of which we could detect any difference. Birds, 25, only 4. So for most of the species, whether we burn as hot as possible every year or unburn, it doesn't matter to them. Small mammals, they were the notable exceptions. And so I put this in because just to illustrate that what's happening with small mammals is really important, but they are not representative of faunal responses to fire in any way. They are an outlier. Come back to that. Second one was this surprised us that when there was an impact, it was much more commonly impact between just burning and not burning, not between the season of burning, hot versus light, not at all. And this is a typical response, and I'll just illustrate this with grass-layer beetles. Again, Lynn collected these. And so these are ordination diagrams. Each point represents a site that's ordered according to the species composition. Sites that are close together means that the beetles at them are very similar. And points that are very different means the beetle assemblages are very different. Got all that? And so this is before the fires, and you can see there's just random colour there. So there's no structure at all in the data, which is just what you want, the pre-baseline data. Then after burning, much structure. But the structure is purely between the green, which is unburned, and the yellows and reds, which is burnt. There's no structure within the yellows and reds. Burnt, unburnt. Whether it's early, late, doesn't matter. What's the contrast? And even with the small mammals, that's shown in the sense of the contrast is between unburnt and burnt, really. I mean, there's a little bit more declines in the lake, but not much. It's really just contrast between burnt and unburnt. And so that got us thinking of, well, hang on, it's fire frequency we should be thinking more about than fire season. And let's set up an experiment in which we focus on fire frequency, because Capalga was just burning every year. And so as luck happened, the bushfire CRC came along and we became key partners of it, and they funded the establishment of this fire experiment at the wildlife park. And it had opened with great fanfare. Remember our chief minister, our first Labor chief minister ever, Claire Martin. You'll also be familiar, many of you, with some of these CDU people, and particularly this one, can I say it? Were involved way back then. And so way back then, it was a collaboration between CSIRO, CDU, and the NT government through the park. And then more recently, John Morgan and his team from Australia have been heavily involved, played a really important role in it. And this is the experimental setup where we've got 3 blocks, so randomised block design. Each block has got one of 6 fire treatments, and the treatments are burning early in the season every year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and unburnt. So that's why I say it's a fire frequency experiment, essentially. But we also have a late season burning treatment. It says L3, late 3, it's actually every 2 years. Oh, look, there's a shout out to Stefan over here. Thanks very much for your lovely drone picture of experimental fires in action. And if you drive down these plots, it's a great thing. I did it yesterday, showed people. The woody cover of woody vegetation varies dramatically, and you can one plot to another. You know, it's great. And so these are Sean Levick's data from LiDAR, just showing that's a major and obvious impact of the increasing fire frequency is the reductions in the cover of woody vegetation. And so as part of the experiment, we've done a lot of sort of things we're looking at. I just want to focus on the fauna. And because, well, I was going to say it's because the plots are small, it limits what we can do for birds and mammals. That's one reason why we haven't done much of birds and mammals. The other is that I'm an insect, I'm an ant diet. So, you know, much of the work has been done on insects, particularly ants, but including their interactions with plants, talk about. But we also done a fair bit of work on lizards that I'll just quickly talk about here. What have we found? Well, I've divided what we've found into 2 categories. One, the things that just really reinforce what we've known from other experiments and other understandings. And one of these is this high resilience. I talked about this is unexpectedly high resilience, even in such a fire-prone landscape. And I've put some lizard examples, just for Chris's benefit. So back at the start of the experiment, we had an honour student from Monash, Evelyn Nicholson. She came in, and just before we lit our first fire, she did her lizard surveys. And then the week after the first fire, she did them again. And here's summary results. No difference. We couldn't detect any impact of direct mortality on the lizards. And so I think that illustrates a really important thing, that even though when we see the fires and then we think, oh, poor animal, they're all killed and it must be the issue. That is not the issue. The issue is how the fires affect the habitat. Longer term issue, how it affects various habitat resources, food resources, shelter, and how it affects species interactions and, in particular, predation for small mammals is the issue. And this is, I'm stepping ahead of myself, this is sort of more resilience, but it's also showing, despite the changes in vegetation structure, for many of the groups, it's not a big issue. Here's Unger Brashmansar's data from his recently finished PhD, which sort of shows this. And so just to lead you through it, we've got the 5 most common species of lizards, and we're contrasting results between high fire frequency and low fire frequency. And we've got 2 seasons of results. The black is one of the seasons. What is it? End of wet. Yellow is end of dry. And so what you need to do is compare the colours. And so if you compare the colours between the 5 frequencies, high versus low, there's no effect at all, except for maybe this gecko gohyra, which is some indication that it's more abundant under the high 5 frequency. But for the others, it doesn't seem to be making any difference to them. And this is coming to the indirect effects being most important to talk about. And so just go through a few groups that were affected by fire. But even when there's a statistically significant effect of fire, the best predictor is the cover of woody vegetation. So it's fire acting through habitat structure is how it works. And then, so for lizards, best predictor of lizard diversity is woody cover. More species with less woody cover. The best predictor of dung beetle abundance is woody cover. More dung beetles, lower woody cover. The best predictor of butterfly abundance and richness is floral abundance and richness, which is increased by fire frequency. So more butterflies under higher frequent fires, modulated by increased abundance of nectar resources. So the overall picture is a clear one. Frequent fire is promoting faunal diversity. So that's reinforcing what you sort of already knew. Some new insights. And one of them is vertical stratification. And this comes from Francois Brassard's PhD. Many of you know Francois. And it goes something like this. So because fires happen on the ground, we sort of focus our thoughts on what's happening to creatures and things living on the ground, don't we? That's pretty obvious. And so most of the ant work here and elsewhere is sort of looking at ground things. But in forested environments, things that are running on the ground represent just one of 4 distinct vertical strata. So above them, obviously, we've got arboreal species. Below them, we've got 2 sets of species. One of them are those that live in the litter, cryptobiotic things in the litter. But even then, below that are these hypergeic things that live exclusively underground. And in terms of fire, it's pretty obvious that fire is happening. It's going to affect these different strata differently, isn't it? So this is what Francois found. The ants that run around above the ground, we call them epigenic ants. They love frequent fire because they're arid adaptants. They love open habitats. Species living or foraging in trees here, they like frequent fire because the tree foraging ants here are dominated by ground nesting things. So however fire is affecting the ground nesting things, they'll affect what's happening in the canopy as well. Ants that live in the litter, the leaf litter, the cryptobiotic fauna, don't like frequent fire. And that's pretty obvious because frequent fire is taking out the litter layer, isn't it? It's pretty obvious. And then similarly, those underground don't care. You know, why would you care what's going on? And so I think we need to be cognizant when we talk about biodiversity responses to fire. It's not just one response in terms of a taxonomic group. We've got these different vertical strata we need to be thinking of, and that this result is probably likely to reflect a wide range of faunal groups as well, not just ants. The difference would be, though, that because especially arboreal ants are those on the ground, you're going to get the same result. But of course, many creatures are specialist arboreal things, and so you might get a different result. The second insight was we've been able to conduct a number of studies looking at interactions between species, not just populations of them. And we've got some interesting results, all to do with ants, of course. And here's one of them to do with ant seed dispersal by ants. So myrmecoccary, it is one of the world's major seed dispersal syndromes, with tens of thousands of species having their seeds specially adapted to be dispersed by ants. And you think, well, that's a bit strange. Ants don't move far, do they? They don't move far, but what they can do, even if they move the seed 2, 3 or 4 or 5 metres, if you're a small plant, that's taking the seed from underneath the canopy away from the parental competition. And that's all dispersal needs to do. A bit overrated, these long distance dispersals. That's all they need to do. And it's interesting, even though that myrmecoccary is found in thousands and thousands of plant species, it's restricted to small plants, herbs and shrubs. There are no big trees that have ants, because moving a few metres is unlikely to get it out of the canopy. Do you get what I mean? And so here's some interesting result. I think it's interesting. Pre-fire, these are these white bars. This is the frequency distribution of distance from 0.5 metre to nearly 20 metres. Before the fire, the biggest distance was about 7.5 metres, mean of 1.6. After fire, look at all these things came out. So it's enhanced seed dispersal services by ants. And the explanation for that is because the fire has simplified the ground layer, it means the ant can just move further, quicker. And then similarly, results of another, one of the major ant plant or ant animal as well, mutualisms, is ants providing defensive services to plants and animals. And 2 of the great ones involve the supply of liquid carbohydrate, which is of fundamental importance to ants, particularly behaviourally dominant ants that need the solar radiation coupled with the metabolic energy of liquid carbohydrate to fuel their very high rates of activity to exert their behavioural dominance. And there are 2 main interactions with ants and liquid carbohydrate. One, you'll be familiar with this, honeydew, aphid-like insects suck in the plant, release honeydew at the rear end to attract ants to come and feed on them. And when ants are doing that, they're acting as their defence force, warding off their predators. And similarly with plants, they do a similar thing. Most people are familiar with, will equate nectar with flowers. Flowers produce nectar to attract pollinators, that's true, but many, many thousands, tens of thousands of plants have special nectar-producing organs. We call this ectofloral nectar, to attract ants. Ants come and feed on them, and when they're doing that, they act as a plant defence force. And many studies showing that it has a really important impact on plant performance by doing that. So this is what we found. Again, fire promotes both of these interactions in quite a significant sort of way. And I'm going to finish with this one, the biodiversity debate. So those who into sort of fire ecology be familiar with this biodiversity. And the idea is this. We know that different species have different responses to fire, right? So then the sort of extension of that is that we need a variety, a diversity of fire patterns in order to cater for all species in the landscape. I know you can't argue against that. It's pretty obvious. And that sort of spawned this idea of fire-prone landscapes, a complex patch of fire history. Some that you can see, the recent fires, but many the invisible fire mosaic reflecting what's happened over the last, whatever, tens of years. And so the idea of this is that we need all this fire mosaic to cater for all the different plants and animals. It's hard to argue against that. And this is the basis of the patch mosaic burning, which is developed in savannas. That's particularly African savannas, but it's conceptually a guiding force behind savanna, not just savanna, but management of fire-prone biomes in general. So intuitively it sounds all good, but when you scratch the surface, there's a bit of an issue. So Kate Parr here was a postdoc of mine and back in the day, and she played a key role in establishing this fire experiment. And one of the things we did was wrote this critique of the biodiversity paradigm, and noting that not all biodiversity is ecologically meaningful at all. Some of it's detrimental. But more importantly is that any fire landscape is inherently patchy anyway. And so the question is not, is there a relationship between biodiversity and biodiversity? Of course there is. The question is, does it need to be actively managed? And to what extent does it need to be actively managed? That is the question. And for that, we need some good data, not just some arm-waving advocacy of biodiversity. And so part of Francois' PhD was to address this question. We took quite a, well, I think it's a nice and novel way of doing it. We took the optimisation approach used in conservation planning. And for those of you who are familiar with this or not, the idea is if you have options of selecting conservation reserves, how do you do it? And the idea is that you can select them based on this optimisation. What is the number and combination of conservation reserves that best represents biodiversity? Get the idea? So we borrowed that to apply to biodiversity management using our results from the fire experiment. And that is, what number and combination of fire treatments is needed to represent ant diversity? And we looked at two measures of diversity. One is species richness, and the other is geometric mean abundance, which takes into account abundance, not just numbers of species. And so here's some accumulation graphs where this is number of species, and the maximum number of species, all the species, is this dotted line, nearly 90 of them. And this is optimizing, so the number of treatments, we've got 6 treatments, each with 3 replicated plots. So for species richness, you only needed the black dots are the maximum. So look at the black dots. We only needed 3 treatments to get all the species. Didn't need them all. 3 of them didn't need. And there's, for GMA, to maximise GMA, we needed 4 treatments. Several of the frequently burning treatments could do this. Unburnt plots never contribute anything to this. And so that's interesting. So it's clear we don't need all the treatments. But this might even underestimate the number or overestimate the number of treatments you need, because adding treatments is confounding or confounded by its adding numbers of plots. And what if we added more plots of the same treatment? Maybe you'd get the same result. Get what I mean? So how do we get around just resolving this confounding more treatments is more plots, and is it just more plots? And this is why we did it. Because you would expect, if you had just looked at the cumulative number of species in any 2 plots, if it was all about adding treatments, then the mean number of species should be higher when the plots are different treatment than they were if they were the same treatment. What's the idea? Well, this is a bit surprising. That didn't happen. So this is species richness. These are plots where the treatments were different, plots where the treatments were the same, no difference, and then the same when you have 3 plots together. Whether the plots were different treatments or all the same treatment, it did not matter. And then the same goes for GMA. And so this is strong evidence that the increase in number of treatments here is actually not the treatments, it's just increasing number of plots. And so it's maybe all you need is 1 frequent burning treatment for ants to represent all biodiversity. Like here. And so this is our conclusion. And you sort of think, well, how does this work? And I think the way it works pretty clearly, if you go to any of the plots at the wildlife park, there's so much inherent patchiness at the local scale. And that's a combination that there's inherent patchiness in vegetation structure, which influences fire behaviour. And in the reverse, there's inherent patchiness in the fire behaviour, which influences vegetation structure. So you have this interactive thing. And even within a single treatment, there's a lot of inherent patchiness. And so it's not that all ant species like the same fire treatment. It's that there's inherent patchiness within a treatment to cater for all ant species. And this is a particularly likely to apply to other groups of animals which operate at a very small scale. It's not going to apply, well, the principle will apply for other things, but the scale at which that happens will be different. And so this is sort of the conclusion. Oh, and maybe just go back to Unger's finding of high resilience of the lizards. The way we're thinking there is that it's not just lizards don't care, it's just that lizards can, because of the patchiness, lizards can find a patch where they can find their thermal blast or whatever they do, and then come, you know what I mean? And that is the same sort of principle applying to lizards, we're thinking. Anyway, so this is the sort of conclusions that have come from all this work. And that is, extremely high resilience. So for most species, it's all fine except for really extreme fire treatments. And then this one, you don't really need this complicated active management of fire mosaics at all, but this sort of combination of frequently burning, which is most of the landscape, but also having some areas that are less burnt. And we don't mean fire exclusion by any other measure, 5 to 8 years is frequent burning, but much less other measure, other biomes. But here, that's what we're talking about, because there is enough natural variability in any fire regime and landscapes that this will cater for all species in the landscape. Back to small mammals. What about small mammals and fire? Well, this is, what's happening? Go back. Fire is not driving small mammals declines. And this is nicely illustrated by Hugh Davies' work from Tiwi. So we've got a fire experiment happening in Tiwi. This happened before pussycats. For some reason, and we're not having the impact that they're having now. And so small mammals can do fine under frequent fire. The idea that small mammals require infrequent fire is just not, there's just not the evidence for it. And so we have 18 plots on the Tiwi as well, free fire treatments, burning every year, burning every 3 years, and unburnt. And look, under frequent, every annual fire, these are all doing fine. That's not a problem, fire per se. There's only one species, it's grassland melamies, doesn't like frequent fire. But the others, that's fine. So it's not about fire. It's about them. And so, that you just got to prioritise cat control, not fire management. And this shows here, look, you could go shift fire from 8 out of every 10 years to virtually no fire. And it doesn't mean you're going to do anything about small mammals. That's you still got total collapse of small mammals there. So it's this. And so now that's the focus of Georgie and Ned's and RIEL's work on Tiwi is control to cats. Finish. Thank you.
And then I'll open the floor up to some questions for anyone in the room has any questions or online.
The fire experiment in mammal sort of made the point, we've discussed it a fair bit, but it's not really an appropriate scale for studying their responses. And that applies for invertebrates. I mean, do you think there's some potential for sort of those mass effect spillover things between fire treatments? Or, on the other hand, has there been much work on the sort of influence of the kind of brain of patchiness in fire mosaics for invertebrates and things? Not challenging, but it's interesting to know whether. So I think I'm being very generic calling them invertebrates. Yeah, some respond on thousands of kilometres and some respond.
So for things that can fly, the strong flyers, there will be an issue there. So things like butterflies and grasshopper, there would be some sort of issue. Although at Capalga, that's not the issue. So that we showed the grasshopper results with Capalga, so that's not the issue. But for things that walk on the ground, that is a hectare. So our the sites are a hectare, but our actual sampling plots are 30 metres by 30 metres within it, and so there's 20 or whatever movement. And so for most of the invertebrates, the ones that walk, there's just not going to be a spillover, so that's not.
I appreciated your introduction, by the way, that you described as long-winded about the importance of experimental studies, which I rabbit on about to undergraduates and also in PhD students and even professional scientists with more and more data that we have available. those large correlational studies, people interpreting those as cause and effect can be problematic. So I really appreciate that. And my question is toward the end of your presentation. When looking for causes of the decline of mammals, there's always arguments one side or the other, but often, is it fire, is it cats? The explanation isn't typically one cause, and couldn't it well be an interaction between fire and cats currently in the landscape is causing a decline? And in the sense now that we have sort of novel landscapes where we do have cats, is it possible that we need to manage fire differently, accepting the fact that there are cats?
Yeah, so I should have made it clear that's how fire's affected. That's the paradigm, is that cats are driving and fires enable. Yeah. I go back to this figure in the sense of, look how poorly fire frequency predicts changes in small mammals. And so that these catastrophic collapses of no species occurred even under infrequent fire. So fire is not going to be a panacea.
Is that this is the absence of cats?
No, this is correct. This is cats.
This is cats.
This is cats. Yeah.
Right.
This is over the time when we had the catastrophic declines.
Yeah, right.
No, cats are here. Yeah.
Good. That makes it a lot. That explains that answers my question basically. I thought that was in the absence of cats.
No, that's cats. Okay. And so cats are not doing their thing everywhere, obviously, and the same with doubling in species richness even under quite frequent fire. And so it's it's much more complicated. So fire undoubtedly playing a role. There's been a lot of studies showing that.
Yeah.
It's not a simple. It's going to that's why I say it's much better to be focusing on that than this, because you can shift fire frequency and maybe have no impact at all. Chris, David,
So, looking at Capago experiments, you did find like a reasonably strong effect of fire on mammals, didn't you? So what do you think was driving that?
I suspect this is at the start of small mammal decline, and so I suspect it's pussycats are playing a role there. The data I showed were total numbers of individuals, which is a bit silly because you compare it, whatever. And so not all small mammals showed that. And the funny thing, I forget some of the data, but possums are weird things. So they were most common under late fires there. That worked. And so it wasn't not as if all small mammals did that, but you put them together, they did. And so I suspect that was back then. It was the very early signs of decline. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the paper that Dick Braithwaite and Morgan wrote, and at that stage they attributed to rainfall patterns, because there had been a sort of decline in rainfall. It was a lag effect, whatever. But it's clear that those declines, it's not just that.
So thanks, Alan. That was very interesting. The notion that there's so much natural heterogeneity in a landscape, and that's much more important than fire and so forth. That makes a lot of sense. But this is all coming from forested areas. Do you think that will translate to grasslands as well? Or can you think of habitats where there might not be that natural heterogeneity?
Yeah, well, I think you find that the grasslands are pretty resilient just generally because it's such a simple system. One of the things that keeps surprising me, though, is the extent of apparent heterogeneity in systems that look homogeneous. You know what I mean? And it's, we have a particular view of the world, but that's not how creatures down their view of the world. It really hit home to me when we did biodiversity surveys in the Victoria region. So those of you who know the Sturt Plateau, you couldn't think of a more homogeneous savanna landscape, flat and whatever else. But the level of ant diversity there was unbelievable, 600 species, and the level of turnover, both east-west, north-south, despite, when we drive down the Stewart Highway, it looks all the same. Creatures there is not all the same. But I think, we don't have data directly on grasslands in terms of that heterogeneity. But I think that's what you'd find, that they're pretty tough anyway. Because the grasses, they're all senescent during the dry, and then so the fire's not so much, and they all recover. And so it's being a simple system, I suspect it's even less of an issue for grasslands.
I had sort of like heterogeneity adjacent questions. Well, so you talked about, that biodiversity not mattering as much because there's that heterogeneity in how things burn. But earlier on in the presentation, you were talking about how early versus late season burning didn't seem to have much of an impact on diversity. It was just whether it burned or it didn't burn. If it's true that late season burns sort of just blow out the understory and burn things really intensely, could it be that early season burns are more beneficial because they create more heterogeneity in that burn landscape?
Yeah, but I think it's distinguishing between what we look at a landscape and what actually happens. So even in these late season fires that look all blackened, there's obviously heterogeneity there. There is. Yeah. And so I'm not saying that the late season fires have no impact. I'm just saying they don't have as much of an impact as you might think when you look at them. And the heterogeneity, the scaling issue is really important. And so here with ants, we can talk about plot scale, but of course for most things, bigger scale. But conservation management is all about management at landscape scale, isn't it? So we just need to look at landscape scale heterogeneity. And I suspect that this issue of inherent heterogeneity at the landscape scale, occurs at landscape scale. So
on that topic of impact, I think you had an outlier for the early burn in May 1991, and you.
So which figure?
Oh, it was in your introduction. Oh, no, it wasn't. It was one of your very early figures, and you were showing your kakadu work. And
yes. Was it grass?
There was no impact of early burn versus late burn.
If I just slip through here. See if we can get that.
No, back.
Not that one. Not this one. Not this one. Not this
Yeah,
one.
that one.
That one. Yeah, that's a grasshopper.
So
Yeah.
in May 91, there's that outlier. I was just wondering if there was a particular phenomenon.
You look.
associated with that.
No idea. I suspect what happened was that Lynn retired early for lunch or something. Plot. Yeah. Okay. And this variation, we can only assume it's to do with climate, whatever the case is. We've got no idea exactly what it is.
Thanks, Alan. So my question is, these plots, they are close to each other, and some may be closer, some may be further from each other. And some of these fauna, I don't know a lot about them, but they are mobile, they move around, particularly when there's fire. So have you investigated where, there's fire and then their movement, between plots, having to do with some of the reasons we see?
Yeah, so we haven't looked movements at all. As I was saying before, is that for most of the creatures we've been looking at, they walk on the ground, and so it's not an issue. So even for insects, there would be an issue for some that are strongly flying. The birds, particularly, for mammals, although some of the small mammals, heck, there's sort of their range. It's problematic. But what you can do is still sample these highly mobile creatures and just ask the question of what's their foraging preference. It's a bit like a Coles cafeteria experiment problem, isn't it? You've got all these different vegetation structures that they have access to. What do they prefer? And so we will be monitoring looking at birds. So Brett Murphy did some camera trapping, and small mammal assemblies are doing pretty well there. We found lots of them, and which is great. And across the whole wide range of biotrends. So I think it'd be good to be doing a bit more. I think more generally, to finish up, we need much more autoecological studies. You can only go as far, even with these experimental things, just describing a response without actually knowing what is the mechanism behind it. And so understanding that movements is one of it, what things are feeding, is really important. And it came home to me, there was an honour student here looking at fruiting by Buchanania. Remember Buchanania? I keep on thinking, what's its common name? Anyway, it's I think the best tasting native fruit, because there's been a concern amongst small mammal folk that the frequent fires are knocking out these fruiting trees, and this is contributing to the small mammal decline. Not that we know anything about what small mammals are eating in terms of these, but anyway. And so Sean Bellairs had an honour student looking at Buchanania across the fire plots, and he found a really interesting thing is that yes, the plants are more common in the infrequently burnt plots, but they won't flower there. They only flower in the frequently burnt plots. And so, contrary to this thought, most fruit production occurs under high fire frequency. And so it's this sort of mechanistic horticological, we just got to do more of it, which could be including animals that can move much further than just a plot, but just understanding their movements, what are they eating, what are resources they use, how's fire affecting it. So I think that's the future of this experiment. And particularly for plants, where small plot size is fine with plants. We just need to have this mechanistic rather than phenomenological understanding of what's going on.
Just before you leave, we've got some online questions from Hannah.
This is one from Eileen online. She is wondering, sometimes the results of these studies may be very informative, but the way they are extracted, this can be misrepresentation in investigation. Do you foresee that there could be issues where practitioners take the information to suggest that they can receive high frequency fires by arguing that they aren't impacting performance such as small mammals?
Look, I think I can understand the concern, but the reality is that is not such a concern. Now, we're not saying you should do it. All I'm saying is that, and people aren't just going to go and burn hot every year just for the sake of it, are they? All these results are showing is that even if you burn like a capel, but burn hot as possible every year for 5 years, it is not causing these destructions and catastrophic effects as we might think. So say it's not that it has no impact. So for example, I didn't say that. It impacts 2 particular groups of animals. The groups that live in the leaf litter, and I talk about that with ants, but the same with leaf litter lizards. But that's obvious because the fires are removing it. It's also affecting the forest passerines that nest and forage in what would be a much denser mid-story under less frequent fire. So they're the 2 loser groups. But with any of those, there's always winners. So amongst the birds, yes, those passerines are having a hard time, but the predators of them, the goshawks, the kookaburras, they're more common because it makes it easier for them to catch their prey. So there's always going to be winners as well as losers for these late season fires. But look, if anyone thinks I'm saying go out there and burn as hot as possible, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the general perception that these late season catastrophic fires, they are not as catastrophic at all as what they seem just by looking at. And that we just need to be aware of our own prejudices of a visual impression when we see blackened landscapes that is bad. And it comes back to the importance of controlled experiments to show this.
Well, do you actually think that these experiments can replicate or simulate these very extreme fires? Because at Capalgate was only over 5 years, so structural change probably hasn't a chance to really happen. Wildlife park, the plots are really small, and at the same time, you need to make sure you don't burn down a wildlife park. So these fires are not very intense. Whereas when you look at a landscape scale, really intense fire, I guess that's probably not represented.
I get what you mean, the wildlife park plots, although the late season fires pretty intense. I've got the figures, I forget what they are. But the Capalga, that was really high intensity fires there. And yeah, it's only 5 years, that's right, but it's still 5 years every single year. And I say, I'm not suggesting you go and just burn hot forever. I'm not suggesting that at all. All the evidence, though, is showing that even if you burn hot every year for 5 years, most of the animal groups are not bothered.
Just quickly following up that, beautiful talk, thank you. In that case, when we are looking at the scale, I don't know what, but what will be the frequency of observing these things? And because what I'm thinking is that the interaction and the other factors, they play a big role. Like after burning, whether there are dead animals that the other species come in, feed on, whether that is making the diversity more kind of increasing or stable there, or whether it's like seeing the open landscape, that plays a big role in not seeing the decline in species, which I think like inherently you would like to think that that's the situation, because after burning it'll be hot for some time and you will think that the species will go down, and after a while they will come down. So how it went after burning over time in that 1 year, that could be, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Although I think what's really important is the longer term, and how it's a bit like plants. So in the dry season it's all burnt and black, but you don't therefore say, oh, poor plants, because they all regenerate, they're right through the week. So it's a longer term. But I think this is getting at the need for much more mechanistic understanding. And so the mechanisms of responses are all those things. So yes, there are some birds, kites and brown falcons running around picking up all Chris's dead lizards, and there's all sorts of things. I think that's a particularly important one. But, we talk about having an open habitat. That's a key one, because there's this big dichotomy in nature between plants and animals that need open habitat versus and they're very shade intolerant, versus the things that live in shady habitats, and there's often just no overlap, very different faunas. And so the habitat openness is really critical. Exactly how that works mechanistically, it's not clear. But I think it's also important in terms of plant responses that fire as a trigger for flowering and other things is really important in a way we don't quite understand. So that even though fire occurred in the dry season, it's triggering flowering the next wet season, and you think, oh, yeah, does that work?
Yeah, you mentioned, you mentioned gamba earlier on. Didn't consider that at all. Is there any experimentations that does consider gamba?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work on gamba, but more to do with how it affects fuel loads and fire behaviour. So we have an annual gamba pulling exercise at the park, because if we didn't, we're surrounded by gamba. And anyone who goes through the Kamali, Litchfield, it's so scary, isn't it? What gamba was doing again. So there have been few studies of effects of the gamba fires on the fauna, but you can just see what it's doing to the structure of the vegetation. It's removing trees. You see as you drive down the Stewart Artwork, it's frightening. Getting into Litchfield Park, and what do you do about it? It's what a huge problem it is. No answers, sorry.
Yeah. But sorry to cut you off there, Alan. I have to cut us there to running out of time. But we have run out of time. But we're meeting over in Yellow 2 in the tea room for morning tea. So if everyone has any more questions I'd like to ask Alan, please meet over there for morning tea, and then you can fire the questions at him. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Alan.